Hello, and thank you for listening to AI SuccessFactors podcast. We help enterprise adopt artificial intelligence. This is Samuel Matthew, your host. In simple terms, AI adoption is a three-step process: identifying the right AI opportunity, tying it back to a business value, and aligning it to a business goal. If you're a leader, needs help demonstrating ROI on your existing AI initiatives, or want to get a buy-in for a new AI initiative, you are in the right place. Our mission is to empower enterprise leaders to navigate, transform, and lead by applying AI into their business. In this show, we interview analytical and business leaders who successfully implemented AI into their business. In the conversations we feature, you will learn how these companies reach strategic business goals. It's a pleasure and privilege for our listeners to develop a point of view from the insights shared in this podcast. Today, we're joined by Howard Park, a trusted advisor to some of the world's largest enterprises. With past roles including VP of Data Governance at Signify Health, a subsidiary of CVS Health, and experience with industry leaders like Google and Accenture, Howard brings an unparalleled depth of expertise. From Silicon Valley to boardroom, he has assessed and implemented governance programs and advised CXOs on compliance, operating models, and data strategies. His unique perspective makes him the perfect guest for today's conversation. In this episode, we're diving into AI governance, a cornerstone of any organization adopting AI responsibly. We will explore its relevance for enterprise leaders, CXOs, and AI practitioners alike, covering key themes such as distinction between data and AI governance, barriers to AI adoption, and a framework that enable innovation while mitigating risk. In the world where AI is transforming industries, these topics are not just timely, they are critical for staying ahead. Let's get started with a discussion that will help leaders navigate the opportunities and challenges of AI governance. Here is our conversation. Hey, Howard, welcome to AI SuccessFactors.
Hello, Samuel. How are you?
Doing great. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Hey, Howard, I am so excited to talk to you today about AI governance. Governance can mean different things depends on the context. It's important to understand how it fits into the broader landscape of data management. To the benefit of our listeners, let's start by clarifying an important distinction. How does data governance differ from AI governance?
Sure. Depending on the maturity of your data governance in your organization, there's a lot that can be extrapolated from your existing data governance into AI governance. So the leadership who's involved, technology, security, privacy, GRC, however that's set up, how you go about tracking decisions, supporting literacy, those kinds of things. There's a lot of similarities that you can extrapolate from, but it's a function of how mature your data governance functions are. If your data governance activities aren't mature, you may have to consider how privacy and security comes into play. One key difference that I am seeing is the increased role of HR. So what happens if you phase in an AI tool and it succeeds wildly, just successful, wonderfully successful, and it ends up impacting some of the metrics that's used for performance evaluations? What about the folks who weren't involved? So I find that there's a lot that you can extrapolate, but HR tends to be something that is underrepresented in data governance that probably needs to be brought into more explicitly in AI governance.
On the practical side, what are some key barriers to AI adoption that governance can help overcome?
Yeah, I tend to think of governance, data governance, and AI governance as an enabler. From a leadership perspective, one of the key things that we can do is to help our users, the folks that want to implement these AI tools, to scope things properly. There's a lot of grand visions about using a technology or using something, and a lot of times, if you make it too big, it's just too hard to get started, or the scope is so large in terms of data use and some of the applicability, it can crush under its own weight. So one of the things that a leader should do in promoting AI use through governance is to scope things right. To what does the proof of concept look like? What does the first 4 weeks or 6 weeks look like? Another aspect of it is providing the right kind of protection. A lot of the folks that want to use AI, the data scientists, the AI ML practitioners, they're not really experts in things like legal and contractual. So what you don't want to happen is for them to do a lot of the work and then realize as they're ready to deploy that we haven't spoken through the security or the legal aspects of it. So as an enabler, you have to think through from an end-to-end perspective what's required to make all that happen. And from a broader perspective, as we learned in data governance, one of the key things that a leader needs to do is provide consistency, even some of the terminologies. What is Gen AI versus non-Gen AI? What does it mean to have humans in the loop? Some of those terminologies, one of the things that we've learned in data governance is you hire a lot of smart people. So at the end of the day, they're going to do what they need to do. So you need to provide guidance, and you need to provide the enabling language and the enabling processes so they can actually get their work done and develop and deploy these things.
I like the way you put the why behind it. So when organizations put together their framework, they need to think when setting up the AI governance, need a framework to think through how AI governance need to be set up. So with that in mind, I remember you were explaining me some guiding principle on how AI governance need to be set up. So can you just brief a little bit about the AI governance framework?
Sure. So there's three things that I've learned from some of the work that I've done and also speaking with others and also looking at different entities. NIST has a framework, and there's some things that are coming out of the EU as well. You'll hear a lot of the same things, and it's evolving, but there's three guiding principles that I come back to. Number one, put people first. Number two, think big and act small. And number three, establish and evolve governance. These guiding principles are really helpful at the program level, at the governance level. How do we think about these things? The put people first is what it sounds like it is. You've got to identify a clear driver of the use cases. Who owns this stuff? Consider the indirect and direct impact, but also think about external stakeholders and the circles of the different folks that are involved. On the think big and act small, you've got to get started, and you can actually use AI ML and some of the use cases that you're looking at to up the game. For example, it might be that you have to actually write your first data policies regarding data classification or data access, those kinds of things. Or it might be that in order to deploy a certain kind of technology, we need to go back and clean up our data or to establish some primary data or master data that you've been wanting to do for a very long time. So use this as an opportunity as a data leader to up the game, to get the investments, to get some of the other things that you've been wanting to do. These are requirements to enable good AI ML deployment. And finally, you've got to start somewhere regarding the actual governance. Start with a framework, start with a checklist, start with something, and then evolve it. Come back to it in 3 months and 6 months and think about how we need to increase the kind of governance or increase the kind of meetings or increase the kind of visibility that's required. You want to document things, but you also have to think about how, because AI governance is evolving so quickly, how as an organization you need to put the right kind of controls and how that evolves over time.
So once if we establish the framework, the next piece of the puzzle would be to evaluate some use cases and managing the risk that comes into play. Let's dive into how these frameworks are applied in real world scenarios to ensure organizations are equipped to navigate AI risk effectively. How do you evaluate specific use case or technology? Can you explain the process?
Sure. And a lot of this is going to depend on the specific technology and the business use case. But there's 4 buckets you want to think about as a leader when you're evaluating a specific technology or a use case. Number one, you want to think about the explicability. How well are you communicating what this is? How much transparency and visibility and traceability are you putting into this? We hear a lot of complaints about the black box and a lot of mystery around how this works. So as a leader, working with the business users and working with the scientists, you've got to think through what kind of visibility and transparency you have in that. Another bucket is fairness. And a lot of that translates into accountability. Who's going to be using this? Depending on the use case, you do have to think about the diversity and non-discrimination. So think about fairness. Fairness always exists from a human-centric perspective. What the machines and the numbers are, they don't have a sense of fairness, but people do. So think about it from an organizational perspective. This is where the put people first comes into play. Another aspect of evaluating a specific opportunity or technology is around the prevention of harm. What are the right kind of controls regarding privacy and protection? What do the contracts that we have in place indicate about how we can and cannot use the data. And also from a technical perspective, how robust is your technology to be able to monitor how that's going on. And finally, respect for human autonomy. What is the human agency and oversight that should be in this? And how do we monitor that process? Obviously, a lot of the benefits that come from AI and ML deployments is about efficiency and automating a lot of things. We still want some sort of humans in the loop, or at least some visibility into that. So how does the AI solution that you're looking at respect the human autonomy associated with that?
Is this something you come up from your experience, or is it a universal pillars many organizations adopt?
Yeah, it comes from my practical experience. It comes from some of the work that I've done at corporations. It comes from some of the external sources. But the four pillars or the four categories that I just described: explicability, fairness, prevention of harm, and respect for human autonomy. Those are my categories. A lot of the frameworks that's out there will cover a lot of the same things, but it's a way to organize some of the key things that you want to consider when you are evaluating a specific opportunity.
If you talk about the explicability or fairness, this is more subjective in nature, right? How organizations interpret it depends on it. So the implementation of data governance varies from organization to organization or industry to industry. Can you explain how this blueprint is different between the organizations?
Sure. And you make a really good point. This can seem very subjective, and this is one of the areas that I think that will evolve in AI governance even in the next 12 months. But it's important to acknowledge it and important to be proactive as a leader to provide that kind of transparency. And regarding the subjectivity, one of the things that I've learned is that because these are human constructs, right? It's the organization or it's the user who's going to decide whether something is fair or not and whether something is explained well enough or not. This is why the leaders have to come out and be proactive and say this, before we implement this, we're going to do these tests. We're going to publish these metrics. We're going to have a way, for example, a way for you to raise concerns or questions. Maybe you have an Ask Me Anything or a brown bag luncheon or something like that, just to be proactive in explaining how data is being used. A very simple way to think about from a leadership perspective how to talk about the fairness and explicability is to just simply consider what are the inputs and what are the outputs. What's the data that's being used? Is it voice recordings? Is it camera stuff? Is it videos? Is it data? What kind of data is being used? Is it masked, et cetera? So what are the inputs? And what are the outputs? Is the outputs a number? Is the outputs a decision? Is an output get automatically put into another system, or does it land on somebody's desk to evaluate? So that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but it's a very easy way to think about how to explain this to the stakeholders. What are the inputs and what are the outputs?
There are multiple frameworks available. For example, NIST is one of it. And how organizations use this framework to guide them through this process?
Yeah, I think it is important to have some sort of a stated framework, and it doesn't have to be something very fancy. It can literally be a spreadsheet or an outline. But what's important to that, it does go back to the transparency. One of the things that you want to indicate to your internal and even external stakeholders is we do have governance. We do have eyes on this stuff, and the governance includes security and privacy and legal, et cetera. So just being able to provide that visibility into our processes, who's involved, I think that's very important. And in order to establish that, if you start with something, whether you create it on your own, whether you create it based on an external framework like NIST or some of the stuff that's coming out of the EU, I think it's important to have something, put it down on paper and say, this is how we're basing our framework of how we evaluate these opportunities. And then, as we mentioned before, you want to establish that and you want to evolve that. You want to come back to it. Even the NIST framework is evolving. It was released. And when I checked back a month ago, it indicated that we are evolving this and the content will be updated, et cetera. So we are all upping the game as we go along. And so from a leadership perspective, it's important to get started, but it's also important to come back to it in 2 months, in 6 months, et cetera, to think about how we do these things and how to improve how we do these things and how we improve the visibility that's given to our stakeholders.
See, I've come across organizations have 1-page long regulatory framework. There are organizations 50-page long framework. So my point is we have to start somewhere, because the way the industry is evolving, for example, now the new LLM models coming up, a lot of challenges. So organizations need to be more flexible and adaptable. So having something started and continuous improvement is the way to go for the AI governance from my experience, I feel.
That's
And
absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
absolutely. Apart from what we discussed so far, there are a lot of deeper ethical considerations such as bias, like you mentioned before, bias, fairness, responsibility in AI applications and such. Let's take a closer look at how these challenges manifest and what leaders can do to address them. And can you think of any real world challenges, especially with the Copilot in picture and other large LLM models in play? Have you ever encountered that kind of a challenge and how it's been resolved?
Yeah, we've already seen some of the issues regarding bias and regarding some of the data cleanup work that we
Right.
should do as we deploy AI models. The Copilot examples that I've seen go something like this. We go through all the effort to put in Copilot that'll do a global search across your enterprise and create text or create emails or create analysis using a lot of the valuable assets that are inside the organization. But it turns out that when you do that, if you don't have a good data classification and data access already in place, the machines are going to go out and access documents and access information that specific individuals should not have, emails from executives or HR information or proprietary information that should only be handled by a small number of people. That wasn't really well protected. So now that information has been embedded into the outputs that are being generated by Copilot. We're already starting to see that. So I've heard about organizations that have had to put a cap or just stop some of the AI ML efforts so they can go back and do some of the fundamentals that they should have had in place a while back. What is our data classification policy? What are the different levels of classification? And have we done our job of looking through our data assets and tagging the data with the right classification and making sure that only the right people have the right kind of access and people understand how that data can and cannot be used?
Yeah, in our offline conversation, we touched up this issue where you have seen where the data being accessed by Copilot without the proper authorization. I have seen that also in my conversations with the leaders. So what scares me in this area is that by the time leadership come to know about this issue, the damage is already been done. I think in that aspect, data governance have taken so much attention now, especially with all these changes, right?
Yeah, one of the key things that I've learned in extrapolating from data governance into AI governance, as I mentioned before, is the more inclusion of HR. So consider this example. So this is based on real examples. It's actually based on a couple, but we were looking at a technology that was being used for call centers. When an organization makes tens of thousands of outbound calls, saving 5 seconds on a certain number of calls, that's a pretty big deal across the board. And we looked at the technology, it looked really great. And as we were ready to deploy some of these things, HR asked the question, what happens if, as you roll this out in phases, it's wildly successful and some of the folks, their performance metrics increase because they are using this technology and their bonuses are higher and their ratings are higher compared to the folks that happen to not be in the pilot program. So how do you deal with that? You as a data leader, you don't want to be the ones responsible for answering those questions by yourself, right? You want to be on the same side of HR, thinking through these issues before you actually deploy these things. It could work in other ways as well. It could be that the AI tools work really well, and it might increase the metrics that are at the corporate level, but actually decrease metrics at the individual's level as well. So that's an example of, I mentioned earlier about how you can extrapolate from data governance into AI governance. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that you need to involve HR early in the conversation to really think through some of the implications of what happens if this works really well.
Nowadays, we see a lot of conversation around that HR in the spotlight with all these new technology introductions. And the one that you mentioned, are these applicable to solutions that intersect with the HR processes like performance evaluation or employee assessment in particular?
There's, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that we are rightfully being very careful when the explicit link between an AI produced output goes into something like evaluating individuals. So obviously, it's very easy to make that case like, oh, we have to be careful and make sure we've got humans in the loop. So I think that argument is easy to make. What's more difficult is when those links are more indirect or it goes through different levels different processes before it gets to the evaluation, the performance evaluation. The example of the call center that I mentioned, it improves the call center efficiency, but it impacts another metric, which impacts another metric, which ultimately gets to evaluating somebody. Some of those connections may not be obvious because it's not a very direct implication to the HR performance metrics.
So that's the catch here also, like we said before, the data leaders wouldn't be thinking this deep in because, or let's look at a CEO or anybody in the CXO levels, wouldn't be looking in this detail what the kind of impact it has. What we have talked about is the developers developing these applications and the users. And apart from that, it has more broader impact in terms of the customers, the brand, right?
That's absolutely right. Depending on your organization, data leaders may be adept and thinking about the company brand. But a lot of data leaders, a lot of the data governance work has been very internal, and rightfully so. How is our data architecture? How is our data integration? How do we need to equip our data owners? All these things are good, but because things move so quickly and the scale possibilities are there, that's one of the benefits of AI and ML. A lot of data leaders may not be used to thinking about the externally facing impacts of some of their technologies, how it impacts their brand. If a customer, or if your clients or your vendors were aware that you were using AI for some aspect of their interaction, would they be upset? Would they say this is in violation of the specific contracts, or this is in violation of the trust that I have placed in you as I visited your website, those kinds of things. These are things that some data leaders may not be used to thinking about.
Exactly, because a lot of times when it comes to people, data folks, and up to the leadership level, they'll be so focused in getting the systems in place, getting the right databases in place, right, the right cloud technologies in place, right, the security in place. But this aspect is something a lot of times been overlooked.
That's right. That's right. And at the end of the day, the job of any leader is to anticipate and to make things efficient, but also to plan ahead and enable the organization to deal with how the world changes. And that's, again, depending on your organization, you as a data leader and your background, you as a data leader, you may be used to thinking about the brand and externally facing things. But if you're not used to that, or if your leadership is not used to that, we have to more explicitly think about impact to the external stakeholders, impact to vendors, impact to HR contractors, et cetera.
As you mentioned, right, adopting AI responsibly requires strong leadership as well, apart from these project level details, because apart from governing it in a project level, we need to manage in an organization level that need a strong leadership and a cultural shift. The bigger challenge is how we embed this principle across the organizations. That's where the leadership comes into play. So how can organizations foster this AI-ready culture through maybe training, maybe education? How do you see this kind of culture being fostered?
Yeah, I think part of it is about balance. You can do a lot of things that you should do, but if you make it too heavy and you try to get all the VPs involved, you may never be able to schedule actually the meeting that you want to have, right? So you have to balance. Again, this is where as a governance leader, you have to think about what's right for the organization, the level of maturity you are, and the urgency of the different things that need to happen. So I think one of the key things is to provide that visibility. You have to make sure that the right stakeholders internally and in cases externally have the right visibility. Are you involving your security, legal, data, architecture, et cetera, customer support, customer success, et cetera? So making sure that there's right visibility to all the different stakeholders and just getting started and making sure that you guide the business users who want these things to happen, right? You need to find a champion and you need to provide the right kind of guidance so that they know that once they do their initial proof of concept or after the training the model, that there is a pathway to actually deploy these things. The last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time in hoopla, a lot of investment, a lot of figuring things out, and then realize we can't deploy it because the contract doesn't allow it, or because we don't have the technology in place, or we don't know who's going to pay for this stuff. So you want to make sure that you've thought through end to end and get things started, and provide the right kind of visibility and tracking so that people can say, yes, we want this. Yes, we know how to make this happen.
Hey, Howard, we're at the top of the hour. I want to hear your best advice for executive leaders. Many organizations struggle to start with AI governance, as we discussed in the podcast. As we are wrapping up, give us an advice. What are the first three things that anyone should consider adopting AI governance into their organization?
Sure. If I could offer one piece of advice broadly to any of the CXOs, I would go back to some of the guiding principles I talked about at the beginning, specifically putting people first. It's very easy to get very excited about the specific technology and how amazing something can work. But at the end of the day, we need to figure out who owns this. Who is the driver? Who within my organization is going to be the ones that are going to be impacted both directly and indirectly? Who's going to want this in place? And who's going to be responsible for monitoring how this thing gets rolled out and talking to the right folks and giving the right kind of visibility? So think about the people who are involved. Make sure that the right people are involved. As a leader, you have to think about who the who should be, if you will, and what their role should be as we develop, deploy, and support any of the tools that are being deployed.
Yeah, at its core, effective AI governance ensures fairness and accountability while fostering innovation. It's about putting people first, as you mentioned, prioritizing ethical considerations and human oversight, and building frameworks that adapt as technologies and risks evolve. Leaders must recognize that governance is a shared responsibility involving collaborations across data teams, HR, legal, and C-suite. By embedding AI governance into the organizational culture and scaling responsibly, companies can unlock AI's potential while safeguarding trust and mitigating risk. The future of AI depends on how we manage it today, and the governance is the cornerstone of that journey. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today, and special thanks to our guest, Howard, for sharing such incredible insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like today's podcast, please be sure to leave a 5-star review. Your feedback is important. We always look for comments and recommendations to improve. This show is available on Apple Podcast, Google, and SoundCloud. Please do subscribe. Plus, you can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and on YouTube. You can find the links to these pages in the show notes or by visiting us at AISuccessFactors.com. We publish episodes bi-weekly on Wednesdays. Please be sure to tune in for the next episode. Thank you and see you next time.